Hey folks, welcome back to our Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark, and today we're taking a look at Munchkin Dungeon. Munchkin Dungeon is brought to you by CMON Limited. It's for 2 to 5 players, ages 14 and up, and games range anywhere from 60 to 90 minutes. And so, true to the spirit of Munchkin, your goal here is to kick down the dungeon door, fight the monsters, loot the room, level up, and become the most famous looter of all. Now here's what a typical setup is going to look like. You're going to set up the dungeon, place the board in the middle of the table, and then along the track from top to bottom you're going to set up the different rooms. You have regular rooms and you have monster rooms, and they're all levels. So you have top of the dungeon, you have the level 1 rooms, then you move to the level 2 rooms, which include monsters with figures. These are really cool, by the way. So you're going to do that, you're going to place the level 2s, and you're going to place the level 3s, and then finally you have the boss that you're going to place at the bottom, and this is random as well. And what you're going to do here is you have 3 levels of boss. It's the same boss, but he gets harder each time because as you kill him, you get tons of fame. So you're going to potentially leave the harder version of the boss for your fellow dungeon looters to take on. Then over to the side of the board, you're going to be setting up your loot. And loot is very important. You're going to get armor and weapons and different things throughout the game as you take on these monsters and take on these rooms. And then there's some other things to note on the board. You have threat pool, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then you have these icons along the side of each of the tracks, and these are going to be room clearing bonuses if you're able to clear every monster. And then you have the monster graveyard, and once the monster graveyard becomes full, the next monster that moves in is going to move all the monsters back out to the dungeon. And of course, there's a series of tokens to take note of. You've got your potion tokens, you've got your shame tokens, you've got threat tokens, you've got your damage markers, and of course, coin. Then each player receives a character dashboard along with the corresponding miniature that will be placed at the top of the dungeon, ready to start kicking down doors. And then on your character board, you have a level up marker placed at level 1, and you will receive 1 potion and 1 coin along with 4 threat cards. Then finally, you have your Fameometer token, which we place at the bottom of the main board, because your goal here is to be the most famous looter of them all and be the first to reach 20 fame points. And then finally, you're going to place the dice with an easy access to all players. Well, except for Randy, because, well, he knows what he did. Now on your turn, there are 4 phases. So the first thing you're doing is kicking down the door, and then you're gonna get into trouble. You're going to resolve the room, and then finally you're going to loot and rest. Now before we kick down our first door, let's talk about monsters. There are 2 types. You see the monsters out on the board. These are your roaming monsters, and they really can move around the dungeon. But you have your level 2, level 3, and finally the boss level monsters. Now there's another type of monster which your fellow dungeon looters might play against you. These are known as the threat monsters on the threat cards. And there's various types here, and they'll be in play and add to the strength of the monsters in the room you're currently occupying. All right, so phase 1 of your turn is kicking down the door. And if you're at the top of the dungeon, you're going to enter in one of the 2 rooms. But if you're somewhere in the dungeon, you have to follow the path along the stairs as you move down and progress forward. That's an important thing here. As you move through the dungeon, you have to move forward. You can't backtrack, and you're ever moving forward towards the boss. So as you enter each room, certain things are going to trigger. You might collect gold, you might collect treasure. There might be all kinds of thingamajigs you're going to get. However, there will always be threat tokens that get placed in the threat pool. And these are dangerous tokens to you personally because your fellow players will be able to tap into them into the next phase. But as you move down through the dungeon, as long as there's no monster in the room, you can keep moving and pushing your luck. As soon as you run into a monster, then you will have to stop and deal with that monster. Now it's important to note that during the course of your turn, the player to your direct left, you really dislike this player because they are in charge, in control of all the monsters. They make the decisions, they roll the dice. So in general, you really dislike this person. Now it's time to actually get into trouble. And your fellow players or your rival players are going to do all they can do to stop you from clearing the room of monsters and gaining any bonuses and fame. And what they get to do is play threat cards. These threat cards can add a monster to the room you're in, or it can be events. And if it's an event, that event happens immediately. However, the rival players can talk. So you're in a lot of trouble because they're going to be ganging up against you. And, you know, in this particular instance, you are the active player and you will take the moral high ground here. But, you know, given the fact that on the next player's turn, you are going to be a rival player, means that you're just as bad as all the others. So this is where the threat pool of tokens comes into place. Each rival player can play one threat card as long as there are tokens to pay for it. Moving from the player to your left, which is still the terrible monster player, will move around the table and each player can play one threat card, again, as long as there are threat tokens to pay for those cards. All right, so there are numerous types of threat cards, but let's take a look at a couple examples. Again, there's all kinds of monsters that the rival players can introduce, such as the 2,783 orcs. It's really quite a bad card, but it's also an expensive card. It would cost 3 threat tokens to invoke this card. And then there's event cards that are particularly bad as well, like I'm the Boss, which allows the rival player, to move the boss from its lair to your room, and you have to deal with this boss, but you don't get any of the bonuses or benefits of defeating it. Then once all the players are done spending threat tokens and throwing threat cards at you, then it's time to resolve the room. This is phase 3. Now you have to fight all the monsters that are in your room, and you're going to look at your character sheet and see what your starting dice are at level 1, and based on however many levels you have acquired at this point, may add extra dice to your rolls. Also, if you spend one of your potions, however many potions you spend give you that many extra dice. There's also a reroll, potentially, for your character that you can roll 1 or more dice. Also, equipment may add additional dice as well. So you need to try to acquire good weapons and armor, potentially, that will help you out. Now, these dice have a blank side, which means nothing happens, which might bring your reroll into play. And then, of course, you're looking for swords for hitting the monsters. You want to clear the room because you want all those bonuses for fame, right? And then there's shields, which will help you from dying in the room as well. And then there's a lightning bolt. Lightning bolts give you special abilities. Your character has its own special abilities that you can choose from, and depending on the items you have equipped, may have special abilities that the lightning bolt will tap into as well. So you'll roll all those dice, calculate your score, and see how much damage you'll do, how much protection you've invoked for yourself, and then it's time for the awful player to your left, the monster player, to roll dice against you as well. So the monster player rolls the dice and calculates their score, doing damage to you and protections for themselves. And some of the monsters have their own special abilities with the lightning bolt as well. So you have to bring all that into play, and some of the rooms have abilities that might hamper what you can do against the monsters. So those are things you have to look out for as well. So all these battles are one shot roll from you, one shot roll from the monster, and you calculate scores and it ends. If there are any threat monsters that you haven't killed in the room, all the threat monsters go away, they go off to the discard pile. Now any roaming monsters, those will stay in the room with you, and in the next round, they regain their health unless you've killed them. Now, if you've killed roaming monsters, they move off to the monster graveyard. And once the monster graveyard becomes full, the next one that moves in will move all those monsters back to the dungeon. And at the end of the battle, if you received any damage, you will take damage marker tokens. And as long as you are still alive, you will stay in that room. You'll check your character sheet to see how much health you have left. But if you die, if you are the one defeated, instead of defeating all the monsters, then you will be removed from the room and put back at the top of the dungeon, and you will receive a shame token. Despite the shame token, you come back into the dungeon fully healed, and you get to retain all your loot and your coins. Then finally, your last phase of your turn is the loot and rest phase. If you defeated creatures in this room, you're going to collect all the loot from that. For every threat monster that you defeated, a threat card, you get 1 coin. Now, for the roaming monsters, they're going to have different results on what you'll collect. And based on what room it is and where you are on the board, will determine it could be fame, it could be coins, it could be loot, all kinds of different possibilities based on that room and that monster. Also, this is the big cleanup part of the phase. So any monsters, like we said before, that have been moved to the graveyard, if that graveyard is full, those monsters are going to come back out to their respective spots on the board. Now, if there are any threat tokens left in the threat pool, all those tokens go back to the supply for the next player's turn. And again, if there were any threat monsters that were used on your turn, those are going to go off to the discard pile. Now, this is going to go round and round, moving from the top of the dungeon to the boss level of the dungeon, getting fame points, and trying to be the first looter to reach 20. Also in this phase, as the active player, you will check to see how many threat cards you have. And if you have less than 4, you will draw back up to the hand limit. Now, we can't end without talking about the boss. As you move into the boss lair, there are no threat points that get generated. However, your fellow players can still play threat cards against you, even if you're in the boss lair. And of course, you have to deal with the boss. And depending on what level of boss is currently there, the first level might have already been defeated by another rival player. So as you defeat each level, he gets harder and harder. So if you do win the battle though, you get 10 fame points. It is a massive jump in the fame-o-meter track. And you also gain 1 level. However, if you do not defeat the boss and are crushed into oblivion, then you still get 1 fame point just for trying. Yay you! Regardless of the outcome, winning or losing, your character will still be returned to the top of the dungeon. And so the game comes to its conclusion when one of the players reaches 20 plus fame points or the final boss card is defeated. And then you tally up all your points and again, say it with me, whoever has the most fame wins the day. Now there's a couple things to take note of. You might get additional fame points based on your loot and of course on your level. And for each shame token you have, you get -1 fame points on that fame-o-meter. And again, now if there's ties, if you tie for the most fame, then the person with the least amount of shame tokens is going to win. If there's still a tie, then you're going to calculate coins and potions. And if there's still a tie, then nobody wins. Well, or you share the victory. It's kind of up to you. All right, folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form. So keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes that still may occur. Now, with that said, I really like the miniatures in this game. They really have brought to life all these monsters and figures that you've seen for so long on the cards. It's pretty neat. And I like that it feels like a much streamlined version and you're moving through the dungeon, and there's a lot to take that in this game, so you have to keep that in mind. But ultimately, folks, if this looks like a game that would be of something of interest to you, I'm sure they would appreciate your support. So I think that's it for me, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.